The river had risen for 3 nights, and on the 4th morning there was no money in the house, and no bread for 207 mouths. A small woman in a faded cotton dress stood in the courtyard of a mud-brick compound on the edge of Asyut, Egypt, with the brown flood of the Nile pushing at the lower fields and a line of children watching her from the doorways. The older ones already knew. When she pressed her lips together like that and went out alone to the far wall, it meant she was going to argue with God. The little ones only knew they were hungry. She had buried a child that week. She had been told by men in good suits, men with clean hands and reasonable voices, that the work could not continue, that a single woman with no salary, no board behind her, and no plan could not feed and clothe and school hundreds of orphans in a country that was not her own, and a language she had learned on her knees. They were not cruel men. They were simply certain, and she had stopped arguing with certain men a long time ago. She knelt in the mud the way she had knelt 1,000 times, and she did not ask for a miracle. She asked for the day, just this day, bread enough for this one day, and the strength to carry whatever came after it. Behind her the children began, without being told, to sing. It was a hymn she had taught them in Arabic, their high voices climbing over the wall and out across the water. And while they were still singing, a boy came running through the gate with a telegram that had traveled 4,000 miles from a church in a town she had never seen, carrying the exact sum she had not dared to name out loud. This happened in one form or another, more times than anyone bothered to count. Money arrived after the last coin was spent, never before. Help came after the door had already closed, and the question that hangs over the whole of her life is the one we want you to sit with from the very beginning. How does a girl who walked out on her own wedding, 10 days before the ceremony, with no support, no training, and no permission, become the mother of more than 8,000 children on the far side of the world? Her name was Lillian Trasher. She was not remarkable to look at. She was not chosen because she was qualified. She was chosen, if we can use that word, because once she put her hand to something she could not be persuaded to take it back. And what unfolds here is not really the story of a stubborn woman. It is the story of what a patient God will build out of one ordinary life that simply refuses to quit. If you have ever felt too small for the thing tugging at your chest, type "send me anyway" in the comments before we go any further, because this is a story for you. Stay to the end, where we show you the single habit that kept her standing for 50 years in a place that broke stronger people in 5. Let us start where she started, with nothing that anyone would have predicted. Lillian was born on the 27th of September 1887 in Jacksonville, Florida, and raised mostly in the red clay of North Georgia. Her people were not poor in the way that makes headlines, but money was thin and often gone, and her father moved the family more than once chasing work that did not last. She was a serious, dreamy child, with a tender stomach for the suffering of small creatures. The family story, the one she told on herself for the rest of her life, was that at the age of about 10 she stood at the foot of her bed one night and prayed a prayer most children would not think to pray. She told God that if he ever needed someone to do a hard thing, a thing nobody else wanted, she would be willing. She did not understand what she was offering. Children rarely do. But something was filed away that night, in a drawer that would not be opened for 15 years. She came to a living faith as a teenager, not gently. It was the kind of conversion that rearranges the furniture in a person. She felt, suddenly and permanently, that her life was not her own to spend as she pleased. After a brief and frankly miserable attempt at ordinary work, she went to help at an orphanage and a small faith institution in North Carolina, places run on prayer and very little else, where the rule was simple: for what you need, and you tell no one but him, and you wait. It sounds romantic from a distance. Up close it is mostly hunger, and laundry, and learning to be cheerful when the cupboard is bare, and the children are looking at you to see whether you are afraid. Lillian learned to cook for 50 on the food meant for 10. She learned to sit with a dying baby through the night. She learned, in other words, the entire trade of her future before she had any idea she had a future. And then, like most young women of her time and place, she fell in love. He was a good man, by every account a kind and capable one, and he loved her, and she said yes. The wedding was planned, the dress was made, the relatives were notified. For a season, Lillian Trasher was simply a young woman about to be married, ordinary, in the most ordinary direction a life can go. And there is no shame in that, and she wanted it. Make no mistake, she wanted it badly. Here is where most people would tie the bow. About 10 days before the wedding, she went to hear a returning missionary speak. A woman, worn down to the bone, talking about the children of a far country who were dying without anyone to hold them, and the drawer that had been shut since she was 10 years old came open. She walked home in the dark, and she could not get her breath. She knew, the way you know a thing in your body before your mind agrees to it, that she was meant to go, not to send someone, to go. She tried to reason with herself. She tried to fold the call into the marriage, to bring it along like luggage. But she understood, sitting up that night, that the man she loved was not called the way she was called, and that to marry him would be to spend the rest of her life apologizing to one of the two great loves of her heart. She gave the ring back. 10 days before the wedding, she broke it off, and she broke it clean, and she broke her own heart doing it. People said she was foolish. People said she was cruel. People said she would regret it. She wrote later, with the plainness that was always her signature, that it was the hardest thing she ever did, and that she never once took it back. Imagine being so sure of an invisible thing that you would wound a good man and your own future to obey it. What would you have done, standing in that kitchen with the dress already made? Most of us, if we are honest, would have married him and called the other thing a phase. She did not. She booked passage to Egypt with her sister, a country neither of them had ever seen, on the strength of an invitation that was barely an invitation, with almost no money and no organization standing behind her. She arrived in 1910, 23 years old, into the noise and dust and dazzling heat of a place that did not want her, did not know her, and could not pronounce her name. Her sister, brave as she was, lasted only a little while before the loneliness and the hardship sent her home. And then Lillian was alone in a foreign country, with no salary, no plan, and a calling she could no longer explain even to herself. Provision came, as it would always come, in a form she could never have arranged. A man knocked at the door of the small mission where she was staying in Asyut and begged her to come quickly. A young mother was dying. Lillian went, down narrow lanes she did not know, into a dark room thick with the smell of sickness, and there on a mat lay a woman at the very end of her strength, and beside her a baby a few months old, filthy, starving, too weak to cry. The dying mother looked up at the strange foreign woman and pushed the child toward her with the last of her arms. Take her. There is no one else. The relatives in the room made it brutally clear that when the mother died, the baby would be put out to die too. There was no one. There was nothing. There was only this small foreign woman who had given up a wedding for a calling she could not yet see. Lillian took the baby home. She had no orphanage. She had no funds. She had a baby in her arms and a missionary board that, when she wrote to ask for help, told her plainly that this was not her assignment, that she had not been sent to start such a thing, and that she should give the child to someone else and return to the work she had been given. They were not wrong on paper. She had no mandate. She had no money. She had no business doing what she was about to do. She gave the baby back to no one. Instead, she rented a small house with money she did not have, and she put the cradle in it, and she understood, standing in that bare rented room with one borrowed child, that man's refusal had just become God's address. If no board would back her, then heaven would be her board. That is the moment, not the wedding, not the ocean, that the whole rest of her life turns on. One sick baby that nobody wanted, and a woman who would not put her down. She named the child, and she fed her, and within weeks there was a second child, and then a third, and the word went out across the province in the way news travels in places without newspapers. From well to well, and roof to roof. There is a foreign woman in Asyut who will take the children no one else will keep. They came. The abandoned, the orphaned, the widowed mothers with nowhere to go, the babies left at the gate in the gray hour before dawn. She turned no one away, which is easy to say and nearly impossible to do, because every yes was another mouth, and there was rarely food for the mouths she already had. Now we need you to catch something, because it is the hinge of the entire thing, and the world almost always misses it. The extraordinary life is not built out of extraordinary days. It is built out of ordinary mornings, repeated past the point where most people quit. Lillian was on her knees before the children woke every single day for 50 years. The authority she would later carry into the offices of officials and the camps of soldiers, the strange immovable calm that made hard men step aside, was not manufactured in those moments. It was assembled in the dark, alone, in a rented room, before anyone was watching. The quiet hour is where the power is forged. The public hour is only where it is spent. She had to learn Arabic, the language she had been told she was too unschooled to master, and she learned it the only way anyone learns anything that matters, by needing it desperately every hour of every day. She learned it from the children, who corrected her mercilessly and laughed at her, and she let them. Because a woman who can be laughed at by children is a woman the children will follow into fire. And follow her they did. The first years were a long argument with starvation. She begged, she borrowed, she went without. She would put the children to bed, having promised them breakfast that she had no way to provide. And then she would go out to the wall and kneel in the dirt and ask for the morning. And in the morning, again and again, the morning came. A merchant would forgive a debt. A stranger would leave a sack of grain at the gate. A letter would arrive from a church in Ohio or Ontario with money that had been mailed before she even knew she would need it. Money that left a stranger's hand on the day her need was still a week away. She kept a record of these things, not out of pride, but out of something closer to awe. And the record reads like a ledger kept by two parties, one visible and one not. Then the world caught fire. War came, the first great one, and Egypt sat on its edge, and the supply lines that had been thin grew thinner. Then revolution swept the country, and the streets that Lillian walked every day filled with anger and gunfire and the settling of old scores. Foreigners were targets. A single foreign woman, unguarded, with a house full of children, and no man to stand at her door, was a target with a sign on her back. People told her to leave. The sensible foreigners were leaving. The consulates advised it. And Lillian looked at the rows of small beds, at the babies who had no one in the world but her, and she understood, with the terrible clarity that visited her at every crossroads, that there was no one else coming, no army, no relief committee, no board. Her, only her. She stayed. There is a night the older children remembered for the rest of their lives. Armed men came to the compound, men with the wildness of a country tearing itself apart in their faces, and they meant to take what little the orphanage had, and perhaps more than that. The children were hidden in the back rooms, silent, terrified, and the men were in the courtyard. And there was no one to stand between them and the door, but a woman barely 5 feet tall in a worn dress. The men had every advantage. They were armed, they were many, and the law had dissolved into smoke around them. By every measure that can be measured, the night belonged to them. Lillian walked out into the courtyard alone. She did not run. She did not bargain. She prayed one short prayer between one breath and the next, and then she did the thing that should not have worked. She spoke to them, in their own language, learned at the feet of laughing children. She told them whose children these were, and whose house this was, and that the God who watched over the widow and the orphan was watching over this courtyard at this moment, and that she was not afraid of them, because she was not theirs to frighten. She stood in front of the door of the room where the children were hidden, and she did not move. The men looked at her. Whatever they had come for, they did not take it. One by one they turned and went back out through the gate into the burning night, and the door held, and not one child was touched. She did not manufacture that. She simply showed up, and stayed, and let a greater authority than hers do the only thing that could have been done. When the officials later marveled that the orphanage had survived the revolution untouched while stronger institutions burned, she had no clever answer. She had only the wall, and the morning, and the habit of refusing to leave. Through all of it, the children kept coming, and the numbers climbed. 40 became 100. 100 became 300. There were years she had over 1,000 souls under her care, children and widows, and the old and the broken. An entire small city of the unwanted, fed and clothed and taught to read on money that arrived, always after it was spent and never before. She built. With her own hands and the hands of the older boys, she built dormitories and a school, and eventually a chapel, brick by brick, on land bought with faith and a great deal of unpaid debt. She became, to that whole stretch of the Nile, simply the mother. They had a name for her in Arabic that meant something close to that, the one who mothers and merchants and farmers and government men used it without irony. This title given to a foreign spinster who had borne no children of her own body and had thousands. And that, the children of her own body, is the wound at the center of the whole shining thing, and we are not going to step around it, because she never did. She had wanted to be a wife. She had wanted to be a mother in the ordinary way, with one husband and a few children and a kitchen of her own, and an arm to lean on when she was old. She had felt that longing as keenly as anyone alive feels it. She had held it in her hands, in the form of a good man and a wedding dress, and she had set it down on purpose, and the ache of it never fully left her. There were nights, she admitted to those who knew her best, when she lay awake and felt the full weight of the road not taken, the husband she did not have, the small private family she had traded for a vast public one. She did not pretend the cost was small. She named it out loud, which is rarer and braver than any river crossing. And then she said the thing that undoes you when you really hear it, that she was, all the same, the happiest woman she knew, not in spite of the trade, because of it. She had given up a house full of her own children and received a country full of gods, and she would not, she said, undo the bargain for anything the world could offer her. That is not denial. That is not a woman lying to herself to feel better. That is a woman who found something so large that the thing she gave up, real and aching as it was, looked from where she stood like a fair price. Most of us spend our whole lives protecting the small house. She burned hers down on purpose and warmed thousands at the fire. The years rolled on, and they did not get easier. They only got longer. There was a second great war, and famine that pressed on the whole region, and seasons when the price of bread climbed past reason, and the number of children climbed with it. There were times the orphanage stood within days of collapse, when the debts had grown so large that closing it seemed not a failure but simple arithmetic, and every time, with a regularity that stopped being surprising and started being almost ordinary, the morning came, a donation no one had solicited, a gift from a person who said only that they had woken in the night with this work on their heart and could not rest until they had given. Help arriving from across an ocean on the strength of a prompting that the giver could not explain. Your faithfulness in the dark, where no one is clapping, may be the answer to a prayer being prayed on the other side of the earth by a person you will never meet. Lillian lived inside that truth, so long it became the air she breathed. She crossed the ocean now and then, in her later years, to speak in the churches that supported her, and the people who heard her were always startled by the same thing. They expected a giant. They got a small, plain-spoken woman who described half a century of impossibilities the way you might describe a long bus ride. How many children, they would ask, leaning forward. Oh, thousands, she would say, as though counting them were beside the point, which to her it was. Because she did not count children, she held them. She never seemed to think the story was about her. Not for a moment. Not once. She would mention, in passing, having faced down armed men, or buried 100 children in a bad season, or built a school with no money, and then she would move on to ask whether anyone in the room felt that perhaps God might be tugging at them too. The reporters and the church boards never could get her to make herself the hero. She did not believe she was one. She believed she was merely the one who had not gone home, and the fruit of that refusal outlived her in ways she only glimpsed. There came a day, late in her life, walking through Asyut, when a tall man stopped her in the street, a doctor by then, well-dressed, established, with children of his own. He took her hands and he wept, and it took her a moment to place the face, and then she knew it. He had come to her as a baby left at the gate in the worst year, one of the ones she had not expected to live, one she had fed through a fever holding little hope. He had lived, he had grown, he had been taught and loved and sent out, and now he healed others and he had children, and those children would have children, and not one of them would have existed if a foreign woman with no money had refused to put a dying baby down 40 years before. She stood in the dusty street, holding the hands of a grown man she had once carried, and you do not get a clearer picture than that of what one surrendered life can do. The child she once carried was now carrying others. He was not the only one. There were thousands like him, scattered across Egypt and beyond, a whole generation that had passed through her gate, and many of them had given their own lives to the same God, in the same way, in the same spirit of the wall in the morning. She would not stop. Into her 60s and her 70s, with her own health breaking down, with younger people begging her to rest, she kept rising before dawn, kept meeting the trains that brought the abandoned, kept building, kept begging heaven for the day's bread for a family that now numbered in the thousands across the decades. They told her she had done enough. She did not seem to understand the sentence. The work was not enough. The work was simply not finished, and so neither was she. Lillian Trasher died on the 17th of December, 1961, in Asyut, in the country she had adopted, and that had long since adopted her, more than 50 years after she stepped off the boat with almost nothing. She was found near the end the way she had lived the whole way through, having spent the last of her strength on the children and the morning prayers. The orphanage did not close when she died. It is there still. The children she gathered grew up and raised children who raised children, and the gate she opened for one dying baby has never since been shut. The province that watched her come as a strange, unwanted foreigner buried her as its own, the mother of the Nile, and the grief in those streets was the grief of a family. She was told she was too young, too soft, too unschooled, too alone. She was told it was not her assignment. Her own board told her to give the baby back and go home. She gave back a wedding ring and never gave back a child. She crossed an ocean on a calling she could not prove. She stood between armed men and a room full of orphans and did not move. She buried more children than most people meet and rose the next morning to save more. She fed thousands on money that did not exist until the hour she needed it, and a grown doctor wept in the street to hold the hands that had carried him. She did not do any of it because she was extraordinary. She did it because the God she served was, and because she made one promise as a child at the foot of her bed, and another as a young woman in a kitchen, 10 days before a wedding she did not have, and she spent the whole of her life keeping both. Her name was Lillian Trasher, not an exceptional woman, a surrendered one. And heaven, we are quite sure, is still looking for the next. The question is not whether you could do what she did. The question is what you are willing to lay down to find out what God could do through you. If this story has stirred something in you, leave the word "send me anyway" in the comments below. And tell us the thing you have been afraid to set down. Hit the bell and subscribe to Heart of Witnesses, because we go looking, week after week, for the ordinary people heaven made unforgettable. And you will not want to miss who is coming next. And here is your invitation for the days ahead. Find half an hour of true quiet, no screen, no noise, and bring 3 things to God: your plans, your fears, and your one good reason for staying small. Set each one down on purpose. You may walk out of that half hour, not with a feeling, but with an assignment. Because if a heartbroken girl who walked away from her own wedding with empty hands could raise a nation of the unwanted on the banks of the Nile, what could God do through a man who refused a fortune to carry medicine into a valley everyone else had written off as a place to die? What did he find at the end of that road that made him laugh at the people who called him a fool? Stay with us and find out.